Chapter 9. The decision doesn't have to be logical. It was unanimous. Anonymous. Hypothetical syllogisms. Conjunctive syllogisms. What is a conjunctive syllogism? In the last chapter, we discussed the second of the three kinds of hypothetical syllogisms, the disjunctive syllogism. In this chapter, we will discuss the third of the three kinds of hypothetical syllogisms, the conjunctive syllogism. In a conditional syllogism, the major premise is a conditional proposition, an if-then statement, and the minor premise is a categorical statement, an A, E, I, or O statement that affirms or denies one of the simple propositions that make up the major premise. In a disjunctive syllogism, the major premise is a disjunctive proposition, an either-or statement, and the minor premise is a categorical proposition that either affirms or denies one of the alternates in the major premise. In a conjunctive syllogism, the major premise is a conjunctive proposition, a both-and statement, which denies that the two propositions contained in the major premise can be true at the same time. The minor premise is a categorical statement that affirms or denies one of the simple propositions that make up the major premise. The elements of a conjunctive proposition. In order to understand how conjunctive syllogism works, let us again try to get an understanding of the kind of statement that is used in the major premise. A conjunctive statement is a both-and statement. Let's look at an example. Jesus is both man and God. The conjunctive proposition is made up of two elements, both of which are simple categorical propositions. The two elements are called conjuncts. There is a first conjunct and a second conjunct. To put it simply, the first conjunct is a proposition before the and the second is a proposition after the and. For example, in the statement, Islam is true and Christianity is true, the first conjunct is Islam is true. The second conjunct is Christianity is true. Conjunctive statements take the following form, both P and Q. Be aware that the word both does not have to appear in the statement in order for it to be considered a conjunctive proposition, although it does underscore the fact that both conjuncts must be true in order for the whole statement to be true. The conjunctive syllogism. Remember we said in the introduction that in a conjunctive syllogism, the major premise is a conjunctive proposition, a both-and statement which denies that the two propositions contained in the major premise can be true at the same time. The minor premise is a categorical statement that affirms or denies one of the simple propositions that make up the major premise. In other words, the major premise in a conjunctive syllogism is not just a conjunctive statement, but a negated conjunctive statement. An example of a conjunctive syllogism is, Socrates cannot be both a man and a god. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is not a god. This syllogism takes the following symbolic form. Not both P and Q. P, therefore, not Q. Conjunctive moods. The mood of a conjunctive syllogism is determined by whether the minor premise affirms or denies one of the conjuncts. If the minor premise affirms one of the conjuncts, thereby denying the other in the conclusion, it is called ponendo tollens, denial by affirmation. If the minor premise denies one of the conjuncts, it's called tollendo ponens, affirmation by denial. As with conditional and disjunctive syllogisms, conjunctive syllogisms are divided into four different moods. Affirming the first conjunct, not both P and Q, P, therefore not Q. Affirming the second conjunct, not both P and Q, Q, therefore not P, which is ponendo tollens. Or denying the first conjunct, not both P and Q, not P, therefore Q. And denying the second conjunct, not both P and Q, not Q, therefore P. Tollendo ponens. Valid conjunctive moods. In disjunctive syllogisms, the two valid moods were tollendo ponens and the invalid moods were ponendo tollens. With conjunctive syllogisms, however, just the reverse is true. All valid moods are ponendo tollens and all invalid moods are tollendo ponens. In other words, while a disjunctive syllogism must affirm by denying, a conjunctive syllogism must deny by affirming. Let's look at an example of each of the valid conjunctive moods. Affirming the first conjunct. Socrates cannot be both a farmer and a philosopher. Socrates is a farmer, therefore Socrates is not a philosopher. Affirming the second conjunct. Socrates cannot be both a farmer and a philosopher. Socrates is a philosopher, therefore Socrates is not a farmer. Fallacy of denying the first conjunct. Socrates cannot be both a farmer and a philosopher. Socrates is not a farmer, therefore Socrates is a philosopher. Fallacy of denying the second conjunct. Socrates cannot be both a farmer and a philosopher. Socrates is not a philosopher, therefore Socrates is a farmer. In each case above, the major premise asserts that both of the conjuncts cannot be true. So we know that at least one of the conjuncts must be false. Notice that in the valid moods, one conjunct in the major premise is being affirmed in order to deny the other conjunct, ponendo tollens. In the invalid moods, one conjunct in the major premise is denied in order to affirm the other, tollendo ponens. These moods are invalid because they assume that if one conjunct is false, the other must be true. But the major premise does not state this. It states only that they cannot both be true. It does not state that they cannot both be false. If both conjuncts are false, then denying one of them does not mean the other is true. A note on formally perfect conjunctions. Once again, as in other types of hypothetical syllogisms, there are circumstances under which invalid moods can be considered valid. In disjunctive syllogisms, this was seen to be the case when the disjuncts in the major premise were exclusive disjunctions. Similarly, in conjunctive syllogisms, when the two conjuncts are contradictory propositions, in other words, they cannot both be true or both be false at the same time, invalid moods also become valid. When a conjunctive statement is contradictory, we say it is formally perfect. Reduction of conjunctive syllogisms to conditional syllogisms. Conditional syllogisms, like disjunctive syllogisms, can be reduced to conditional syllogisms as follows. Socrates cannot be both a philosopher and a farmer. Socrates is a philosopher, therefore Socrates is not a farmer. Becomes, if Socrates is a philosopher, then he is not a farmer. Socrates is a philosopher, therefore Socrates is not a farmer. Notice that the only proposition in the argument that is changed is the major premise. The conjunctive statement in the major premise is changed to an equivalent conditional statement by making one conjunct in the original syllogism the antecedent and the denial of the other conjunct the consequent. This is done by observing the following rules. Rule number 1. The minor premise and the conclusion must remain unchanged. Rule number 2. The major premise is changed from a conjunctive statement to a conditional statement by, step 1, placing the conjunct affirmed in the minor premise in the place of the antecedent, and step 2, placing the denial of the other conjunct in the place of the consequent. Summary. In a conjunctive syllogism, the major premise is a negated conjunctive proposition, and the minor premise is a categorical proposition that either affirms or denies one of the elements of the major premise. A conjunctive statement is a both-and statement. Conjunctive syllogisms are divided into 4 moods. All ponendo tollens moods are valid, and all tollendo ponens moods are invalid. Unlike disjunctive syllogisms, which affirm by denying, conjunctive syllogisms deny by affirming. The conjunctive proposition is made up of 2 elements, both of which are simple categorical propositions. The 2 elements are called conjuncts. The first conjunct is a proposition before the and the second is a proposition after the and. When the conjuncts are contradictory, we call the conjunction formally perfect. If the major premise in a conjunctive syllogism is formally perfect, it is valid in all 4 moods.